Welcome to today's Conversations with the Fed on the Beige Book. My name is Eric Garcia Luna, Regional Outreach Director at the Minneapolis Fed. Today I'm joined by my colleagues Joe Mann and Ron Wirtz. And before I turn it over to them, a brief announcement. Today's webinar is part of our Conversations with the Fed discussion series. I pasted a link to the previous webinars in this chat. And the slides for this presentation and a copy of the video link will be emailed to all registered attendees next week. Now, if you want to know more information about the Beige Book, please visit minneapolisfed.org. I've also pasted that link on the chat. We will have some time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please type any questions you may have in the Zoom chat, and I will pose them to our presenters, or I'll answer it verbally as we have time. Finally, at the end of this presentation, you'll be presented with a quick 3-question survey, which we hope you'll complete to give us feedback on this event. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Joe Mann.
Thanks, Eric. Good afternoon to everyone in our audience. Thank you for joining us for a topic that is very near and dear to our hearts within the regional economics team at the Minneapolis Fed, and that's the Beige Book. A big part of our responsibility is for writing the Beige Book, and today's presentation is going to be about exactly what the Beige Book is, why we write it, what you can expect to find in the Beige Book if you've never read it before. And if you have read it before, maybe a little bit more context and appreciation for why we write the Beige Book and for what we put in the Beige Book. So a little bit, just a quick outline of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to start us off by giving a kind of a bit of a history and background of the Beige Book, why it exists and how it came to be, and then how it came to be sort of so publicly focused on by the financial press and others as a sort of a Fed watching document. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the Beige Book is actually structured and what goes into the Beige Book and what kind of information is there before I turn it over to Ron Wirtz, our colleague, and he's going to talk about how we gather the information that goes into the Beige Book and how the actual process of writing and putting the Beige Book together works. Then I'm going to turn it back over to Eric, who's going to talk a little bit about some evidence on how the Beige Book is as a summary of the economy and a predictor of the economy, before we have a little bit of time for some kind of fun media attention that the Beige Book and that we in Minneapolis have gotten for our contribution. That's kind of a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. Before I go any further, I'd like to give kind of a standard disclaimer, and I'm for myself and also for Eric and Ron, that our opinions are our own, and we're not necessarily speaking for the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System in our opinion. So mostly we're just going to be talking about the Beige Book and not really getting too much into opinion. So a little bit of background about the Beige Book. First of all, you might wonder why it's called the Beige Book. Well, that's because it actually has a beige cover. You can see sort of a older image of what the Beige Book looked like back when we actually physically printed a copy of it. We changed it a few years ago. We no longer actually print a hard copy edition of the Beige Book anymore. It's an electronic document now. But this is how, one of the last versions of the Beige Book with the actual beige seal on the cover. It actually goes all the way back to 1970. And what it was a compilation of regional conditions within the 12 Federal Reserve districts that they produced as part of the Federal Open Market Committee cycle. Now, the Federal Open Market Committee, if you're not familiar with it, is the monetary policy making body of the Fed that's made up of the presidents of the 12 reserve banks and the members of the Board of Governors. They're the ones who set that benchmark interest rate. And one of the things they do in their meetings is they go around the table and they give a summary of economic conditions in the different Federal Reserve districts. And so the Beige Book is kind of a record of that, part of that process. And as you see here, it was first put together in 1970 at the behest of then Chairman Arthur F. Burns, who wanted to kind of get all that information that was shared at meetings together into one document. Originally, it had a red cover. When they started releasing it publicly in 1983, so there was kind of a federal congressional inquiry into the Federal Reserve's sort of intelligence gathering activities. And that's when we started releasing the Beige Book publicly as part of kind of a transparency effort. And that was when they put the beige cover on it. So it went from being red to being beige. That's when it was started to be released publicly. But it wasn't for a few more years in 1987 when the public really started paying more attention, and the financial press in particular started paying more attention to the Beige Book. Why 1987? Well, on that day, almost 38 years ago, this month, there was a famous stock market correction, the Black Monday crash of 1987. As you can see, this received a lot of media coverage. People were worried at that time. It was the largest drop in the Dow Jones index since the Great Depression. There was a lot of concern at that time about whether this was going to lead to a further sort of financial crisis, and whether we might see a severe recession. And so a lot of eyes at that time turned toward the Fed because the Federal Open Market Committee was going to have a meeting shortly thereafter, and the financial press were trying to read the tea leaves to try and figure out what the Fed was going to do in response to that event. And some intrepid financial reporters noticed that there was this document that had been released prior to the FOMC meeting. Part of the process of making the Beige Book public was that they actually started releasing it publicly before the FOMC meetings. Again, as kind of a record of intelligence that the Fed was gathering. So that was the first time that the Beige Book really started receiving a lot of public attention. And it has sort of from Fed watchers and tea leaf readers ever since then. If you're interested in a little bit more background on this before I turn to the next section, I'll just put a plug in for an old article on our website, minneapolisfed.org, that was written by Art Rolnick, our former research director, and others, that kind of looks at the Beige Book's history and its role as an economic indicator. And that article was called The Beige Book, a better mirror than a crystal ball. You can find that on our website, and that covers a lot of this history. So that's kind of a quick overview of how the Beige Book came about. Again, it was kind of meant to be sort of a digest of the Fed's ongoing economic conditions monitoring efforts. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what's in the Beige Book and how we set it up. So you can see here, this is actually kind of the virtual cover of the current Beige Book. It comes out 8 times a year, again, in conjunction with the FOMC cycle. As you can see on the title, it's colloquially referred to as the Beige Book, but the official name of the document is the Summary of Commentary on Current Economic Conditions by Federal Reserve District, which is a rather dry title, sort of makes the Beige Book, the title of Beige Book, seem sort of spicy by comparison. But that is a very descriptive title, and that is exactly what it is. It is a summary of commentary. So I'll get into a little bit more about kind of what material is in the Beige Book, but the Beige Book isn't necessarily meant to be a thorough, comprehensive review of everything going on in the economy. Obviously, there's a lot of data that come out that tell us about what's happening in the economy. The data come out with a lag. They tell us about what's been happening. So what the Beige Book is part of our efforts to get out and connect with communities across our regions and really talk to a lot of people who have on the ground in-depth knowledge about what's happening in the economy. And we summarize their commentary in the Beige Book. As I mentioned, it's published 8 times a year. It's released a couple weeks before the Federal Open Market Committee meets. And there's a section produced by each of the 12 reserve banks, including Minneapolis, and they all have kind of their own sources and their own methods in reporting it. But really what it's meant to be, again, is sort of a digest or a summary of the commentary that we're hearing from contacts and sources in our networks. Ron is going to talk more later in the presentation about exactly what kinds of sources and content we use. Another key thing to note about the Beige Book is it's very now focused. So we release it 8 times a year when the FOMC meets. And really what it covers is the period since the last Beige Book was written. So a lot of what's interesting in our economy happens over a longer time span than that. We're really very cyclically focused, really focused on what's happening kind of at a business cycle frequency and what's been happening most recently that's not necessarily reflected in the data yet. So as I mentioned, we really do try to emphasize the change since the last report. Now, that's not always possible or relevant when you're talking about industries that are heavily seasonal, like agriculture or tourism. Sometimes you really want to make a comparison to a year ago or to the last, to the last relevant cycle in that industry. But generally speaking, we want to focus on what's been happening, what's news right now, and we attempt to the extent possible to give kind of a quantitative characterization of qualitative conditions. What do I mean by that? Well, we break the economy down into different sectors. And we try and characterize whether we saw activity in that sector increase, decrease, or whether it was unchanged since the last report. And we kind of give a sort of, again, a qualitative characterization of how fast or slow that increase or decrease might have been. So you can actually see we kind of have a hierarchy of descriptors that we use. Obviously, flat is no change at all. And then a little bit more than no change we call slight. A little bit more than that is modest. Moderate is what we consider about average, and then strong is above average. So if we say something increased moderately, that means it grew at about a typical pace that you might expect. If we say it was modest, that means it increased, but at a slightly less than average pace. And that's kind of the general idea. They're very loose qualitative characterizations. Eric's going to talk a little bit more about how we can think about these in more precise terms and how we can kind of map them to the economic data that come out. But really, because what we're trying to do is get out ahead of the data, we don't necessarily have, we don't necessarily try and make really crisp, precise characterizations, but more of these kind of sort of general characterizations, qualitative characterizations of industry conditions. Few words about why there is so much attention paid to the Beige Book, why the Fed puts so much effort into going out and gathering the information that we publish in the Beige Book. I think there's a few really key roles that we've identified that the Beige Book plays. First of all, obviously, it gives you a picture of current economic conditions. The real key thing that we're hoping to accomplish with all of our efforts at monitoring economic conditions in our regions that's reflected in the Beige Book is trying to identify emerging trends that we're not yet seeing in the data. Again, to get out ahead of the data, because the data that we have, especially at a regional level, tells us about what happened in the more or less distant past. And when we want to inform our policymakers, they need to know about what's happening right now and what kind of trajectory the economy is developing on. We also like to do this regionally because it sort of reflects the Federal Reserve's unique decentralized federated structure, and that we get kind of comparisons of conditions across regions. It's a public document, and we think of it as being a public service. So we do produce it as kind of a source for the media on our efforts to assess what's happening in the economy. And also, I think just sort of more intangibly, it's a symbol and a digest, if you will, of our efforts as a Federal Reserve to get out and listen to communities and to contacts across our regions to really get a better understanding of what's happening in the economy and how economic policy is affecting the real world. And having the discipline of having to produce it on a regular cycle, it gives us a little bit of structure that kind of requires us to do this on a regular basis, and it just imposes a bit of discipline on us. So those are the kind of key things that the Beige Book does. I think a few words on what you shouldn't sort of try and read too much into the Beige Book about. So what the Beige Book kind of is not is, I think, one of the most important things. We don't necessarily try and give you a national economic summary. It is if you go back again to that formal dry title, it's a summary of conditions by region, okay? You don't necessarily want to just try and add those up because not all of the districts are equal size, well, either in population or in economy. So you don't necessarily add up the 12 different sections and get a summary of the national economy. Obviously, it's not comprehensive. Each of the district's reports is only about 1,200 words. So you can't summarize everything happening in the economy in that small of a space. It's meant to be a summary. We don't really think of the Beige Book too much as being an economic forecast. It really is more of a nowcast. We're trying to get an idea of where the economy is right now and just focusing on filling in that gap between where the data are and what's happening right now is enough of a lift without trying to get out ahead and get a crystal ball and get a view of where the economy is developing. There are other tools for doing that. And then the other thing, even though the Beige Book gets covered so much around FOMC time, it isn't necessarily, I wouldn't read too much into it as a guide to what you might expect the FOMC to do, even though the financial press likes to try and read into it in that regard. So that's a little bit about what the Fed is. And one way that I think is really nice of summing it up is a pithy quote from former Vice Chair of the Fed, Alan Blinder, who's a professor of economics at Princeton. And he said, as you see on the slide here, you can get your information about the economy from admittedly fallible statistical relationships, or you can ask your uncle. Now, when Blinder said this, he was, I think, trying to defend the idea of the statistical modeling tools as being fallible, but still useful and more useful than just talking to a person. But the Beige Book is kind of an attempt to sort of split the difference between those two things. It's not just asking your uncle. It's asking a lot of people, getting their stories, and kind of trying to tease out a cohesive narrative in all of those things. So that's kind of, I think, a nice way of thinking about where the Beige Book falls. It falls in between those two poles when we think about all of our intelligence gathering tools. Before I wrap up, just to talk a little bit more about what's actually in the Beige Book, what you can expect to find in every issue. As I mentioned, there's a national summary that kind of gives a rundown of a quick sort of bullet point summary of district by district. Each of the 12 reserve banks produces its own section for the Beige Book. So Minneapolis has its section along with all the other ones. And every one of those districts produces 3 sections in common. And those really reflect the dual mandate. So the monetary policy made by the Fed is made with 2 goals in mind, and those are maximum employment and price stability. And in the service of those, every one of the districts reports on labor markets, just generally kind of the status of employment and wages. In fact, it used to be called employment and wages, but we try to take a broader focus too and think about the perspective of workers as well. And then prices or inflation. You can kind of think about that as being sort of an attempt to kind of get ahead of CPI, whereas the labor markets section is really more of an attempt to get ahead of the jobs report numbers that come out on the first Friday of every month. And then every district also gives kind of an overall summary of economic activity that you can kind of think of as being maybe sort of an attempt to get out ahead of GDP, of the sort of overall output of the economy. Obviously, each of the Federal Reserve districts varies quite a bit, both in terms of its geography, but also in terms of the industries that are important in their region. So the sectors that are covered by districts vary quite a bit, and it's really up to the individual reserve districts to determine what sections they want to cover. You can see a list here that I have on this slide of some of the sectors that are covered by different reserve banks. The ones that are highlighted in that teal color are ones that we include in the Minneapolis report. So you can see here that we cover consumer spending. We also cover manufacturing, construction and real estate, so building and home and commercial real estate selling activity. Agriculture, obviously a very important industry in the Ninth Federal Reserve District, as is energy. So we have a section on agriculture, energy, and natural resources, which also will include kind of mining and forestry as well. And then in Minneapolis, we have 2 sections that we added in 2021 covering worker experience. That's an attempt to kind of get at the labor market from the perspective of the supply side of the labor market, that is workers, and get more information directly from workers. And then also from minority and women-owned business enterprises as well. And like I said, there is a national summary as well. On a rotating basis, different reserve banks compile the Beige Book and write up kind of a list of summarizing kind of the themes that emerged across districts in their reports. And that's at the front of every Beige Book. So that's what you can find in every Beige Book, kind of give you an idea of the rundown of what's in there. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ron, who is going to talk a little bit more about how we compile and gather the information that's in the Beige Book.
Thanks, Joel. Let me do the little handoff of the clicker here. And Joe, can you just give me a confirmation that you can see that?
Confirmed.
Outstanding. So I'm here to talk first and foremost about kind of the sausage making process that is the Beige Book. Before I do that, I just want to say thanks to everyone for showing up. You know, in years past, when I first started doing this a little bit, not quite a decade ago, I don't know that there was the visibility of the Beige Book or the interest in the Beige Book. So the fact that we've this many people just kind of here to listen about how the Beige Book is put together and why, I just really am very encouraged by that, and even more encouraged by kind of the response that we get from businesses and workers about being able to give information to the Fed to try to help understand how this economy works. So I just wanted to say that before getting started. So as I mentioned, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the information gathering process, or kind of what goes into the Beige Book. So where does all of our information come from? It's really simple. It sounds almost trite, but it comes from you. It comes from the economy itself, all the businesses that are across the Ninth District, all the workers that are across the Ninth District. We're out there trying to get as much input in different kinds of forms as possible. And we're really out there kind of with different kinds of tools, methods, and even forums in terms of how we're trying to gather that input. And what the goal is we're trying to get different types of information, and we're trying to get information that also has varying levels of depth and detail. You know, where Joe kind of mentioned, we're trying to get some qualitative information, but we're trying to get it at a scale that it really kind of looks a bit like quantitative information. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So the types of information that we're looking at really kind of come in a lot of different molds. So we're looking for different metrics. And as you might expect, the Fed's really kind of interested in overall economic activity. So when we're out talking to businesses or trying to get input, we're really interested in things like sales, revenue, profits, things that are kind of the top line figures that, you know, whether or not the business community is feeling good or maybe not so good. But we're also very interested as it relates to monetary policy and other things like jobs. Obviously, part of the dual mandate is maximum employment. So we're always interested in whether employers are hiring. As Joe mentioned, we're also interested in the worker experience as to whether or not they are able to find jobs that they want. Then we're also interested in inflation, obviously, is a very big deal right now. So we're always asking about prices and wages, which can lead into prices. But then we're also really interested as we're looking forward. We want to know what those challenges that businesses are facing, kind of what are the big ones? Is there anything that monetary policy can have a role in or have an influence on? And then without necessarily wanting to try to predict the future, we do want to know what businesses see in the future. The Fed kind of has to set monetary policy with some guide to thinking about where the economy is going, and businesses can help us understand what they are seeing. We're also trying to get a real diversity of insights from kind of different angles. So we're looking for insights by sector. So we want to know about manufacturing, we want to know about construction, we want to know about those other sections that are in the Beige Book that will give us a different view from different places in the economy, different kinds of businesses. But we're also interested in different kinds of, or the same kinds of businesses across states. So we have 6 states in the Ninth District. We have contacts in all of those states. We get survey responses from people in all of those states, because geography doesn't necessarily matter as much as, say, sector, but it can matter because agriculture, say, in Montana may be performing differently, maybe because of drought conditions, than it is in Minnesota. We're also interested in how different firm traits relate to economic activity. So we want to know if big firms are performing better or more poorly than, say, small firms. And so we're always asking kind of demographic kinds of questions about the people and the businesses we talk to, so we can understand it kind of at a very granular level about how the economy is working and for who. And then we're kind of looking also at different time references. Now, Joe mentioned this is really kind of a nowcast, but we're also interested. So not only are we interested in kind of the point in time right now, so we say, are you hiring? That's a single point in time, but we also want to know, is this different than what it was earlier? So say from the last report. So if one of our surveys is monthly, if we ask this month, we want to compare it to last month. Then we also ask, what's your expectation going forward? So we have some idea of the trajectory, that change over time, that is also very valuable. All of this kind of produces kind of a really big vat of different kinds of information. We get, especially through surveys, we really do get a lot of macro insights. Those surveys too, though, we get lots and lots of commentary. We get lots of individual insights, micro insights and commentary, what I like to call kind of macrododal information, because it's not necessarily quantitative in a scientific way, but it's also better than anecdotal. So we're really trying to gather really as much of that macrododal kind of evidence to give us the best view as we can possibly get at the time we have to put that report together. So what tools do we use for gathering this kinds of information? First and foremost, we're leaning more and more into surveys. Again, that's one of the ways where we can get both a collection of kind of like types of businesses to give us insights on how things are going. They also give us a lot of commentary. So surveys really are invaluable for those macro and micro insights. Oops, excuse me, wrong direction. We also do a lot of roundtables, a lot of in-person kinds of communication, and we do it with a number of different kinds of audiences. So we might do I will be doing one later in the month with a Chamber of Commerce, getting some general businesses around the table. We also do industry-specific ones. In the last month, we've done agriculture and high tech and labor unions. And then I'll be doing a roundtable next week on workforce with a group of workforce people in northern Wisconsin. So we're really interested in kind of getting in front of people to kind of be able to have that conversation that you really can't have via a survey or even via email, where you can kind of have some give and take and really understand a group of people and how they understand certain conditions. Then we also have one-on-one industry contacts. So Eric and Joe and I all have a stable of people that we can go to if we're interested in maybe how a certain sector is reacting. Maybe there's some new news or some pressures in a particular sector that we need to learn more about. We all have people that we can go to get a little bit more information and try to get a better understanding through their understanding, say, of their particular business sector. And then we also still gather a lot of data, some public data, simple things like unemployment insurance claims, but also local building permit data, airline boardings, lots of other things. And then there's some private data that we contract with. We don't typically get to pay for a lot of data, but we have understandings with different kinds of businesses that share data with us because of our public mission. And the reason we also are gathering a lot of that data is people can tell us lots of things, but we're always trying to triangulate what we're hearing from businesses, from workers, to what the data is telling us, and vice versa. So we're not necessarily leaning too heavily on one individual thing. We're trying to get lots of things and see how they compare and how they give different, how they kind of give different insights into what we're really trying to answer. And the other thing I think we really need to emphasize too is sometimes we're getting very confidential kinds of information that you wouldn't just share at a party in an open forum. The reason is that the things that we're trying to learn, we're asking sometimes quite sensitive questions. And we need businesses to be open and honest about how their businesses is experiencing the economy right now. And so what we really try to emphasize is confidentiality with everything that businesses give us. We make sure we have disclaimers on our surveys to not share any information that might help identify that particular business, especially in any kind of public way. And the Beige Book and the Federal Reserve policy actually requires that whenever we are writing something in the Beige Book itself, that it not give any information that would allow somebody to be able to, for somebody in the public to essentially identify who that source is. Because we really depend on that confidentiality, that trust with businesses, with workers, to share openly and honestly with us, so we really get kind of the right picture. So that confidentiality matter is really vital to the Federal Reserve and to Joe and Eric and I. As I mentioned, surveys really are kind of instrumental to our intelligence because it gives us that macro and that micro. So I wanted to spend just a little bit of time telling you about what we do now. So right now we have a monthly business pulse survey. That's about 3 years old, a little bit more than three months old, and we're really trying to build that one up. On a monthly basis, it really does give us insights at a frequency that help us understand the real economy for the Beige Book purposes. But we also have a lot of other surveys that are also really supplementary to the things that we want to try to learn in the course of any cycle. We do a couple that are either 2 times a year or 4 times a year. We also have a couple annual. These are actually our longest serving ones, the manufacturing and professional services. Those are, I think, 15 to 20 years old each. And then we also do some ad hoc surveys. For example, we did a survey of nonprofits in the Dakotas and Montana this year. We probably won't do that next year. Hopefully we can get in with a different group that might offer us particular insights into a certain sector that's of interest to us. all told, we expect to have about 5,000 responses to all of our business surveys this year. So if you just kind of do the math, that gives us anywhere from 5, depending on the cycle, gives us anywhere from 5 to maybe 700 insights from businesses every cycle. And that's really important. That really gives us kind of a base for what to think about what our first draft might sound like. Now, that's not the only thing that we depend on in terms of our characterizations, but it really does give us a good start on trying to understand what businesses are experiencing. As Joe mentioned, we also have introduced this thing called the worker experience, and we're doing more labor surveys, so we want to understand what workers are actually experiencing. It was not uncommon at all. It's been common for the last at least 10 years. When you go to businesses, you were hearing, yeah, it's tough to hire. And we are hiring, but we can't find workers. So you heard a lot about labor shortages. What you didn't hear much about was, well, what's the workers' experience in that labor shortage environment? Particularly now, as labor markets have gotten a little bit softer, kind of useful to know what the worker is experiencing in that transition from very tight labor market to looser labor market. And so in 2021, we got this initiative started in terms of trying to interview more workers so we understood the supply side. And we really had to start with ad hoc surveys, mostly with nonprofit and other government workforce agencies who had contact with workers. This year is new in that we've developed a partnership with YouGov so we can get a little bit better benchmark data on workers' experience. We're hoping to carry that through. We're not making information public on that right now. We're hoping to develop that data in a really robust way that hopefully we can bring data public like we do with some of our other surveys. We also do live audience polling. So the reason is that every time Joe or Eric or even Neil sometimes is in front of, President Kashkari is in front of an audience, that's an opportunity to engage with that audience and listen to what they have to say about the economy. It's really a good chance to kind of check the crowd pulse. So if you happen to be in front of a group of bankers or a group of manufacturers, it's really useful to be able to hear from them in some kind of systematic way about what they are experiencing. So we use a tool called Poll Everywhere that we use in speeches, and I use in webinars, and we use in roundtables sometimes, and we use in President Kashkari's town halls to gauge the pulse of the audience that's there. And as a matter of fact, we're going to do it right now because I really want to give you that experience of being able to give some feedback to the Minneapolis Fed. Okay, so if you have your phone with you, I'd really like for the audience just to participate in one question, because there's actually a question that I can ask you now that's really relevant to what the Fed is interested in, and I'll show you here in a second. So if you have your phone, we're going to get logged into this Poll Everywhere survey. Okay, so you're going to send a text to this person that is 22333. Pretend that's your mom or your dad, a significant other, a child. Okay, that's the person. And you're going to text the word Minneapolis. Okay, if you type it in and it capitalizes, that's just fine. And once you have typed the word Minneapolis, hit send, and then you're going to watch for a little pop-up box. Okay, and it will tell you that you've been logged into this particular survey. And again, the more people that are involved in this, the better answer we'll get from this particular crowd. And again, I think I saw somewhere on here that we had about 200 people. So that's actually a really nice survey if we can get it on this particular question. I think you'll understand once I get to the question. So hopefully people have had the chance to log in. I'm hoping that everyone's being involved. Stay in text mode. You're going to answer this question via text. Okay, if everyone's ready, here comes the question. Okay, so obviously you know that the Fed is really interested in inflation. So all I need you to do is pick the corresponding letter, put it in your text box, and hit send, and we'll get an idea of what people think about inflation with this crowd. As I mentioned, I use this very often in speeches. And it really does two things. First, the interactive part is really kind of nice. I think people are always a little bit more engaged when there's something to do. And it's a really easy way for the Fed to grab some insights. Now, we're not going to set monetary policy on today's survey as it relates to inflation. But again, it's a useful tool to always keep checking the pulse of the people that you are in front of. And that's really what the job is for the regional outreach team at the Minneapolis Fed. And as you can see here, what we're seeing is that maybe this crowd is actually starting to feel a little bit of pressure in terms of inflation. Now, again, this audience might be feeling it a little bit different than others that we talk to, but I see this, and I feel it, and this will be part of what we consider as we put together Beige Book kinds of anecdotes. So thank you very much for your participation. I appreciate you indulging me on that. Why surveys? We do know that there are a lot of surveys out there, but I do just want to make one last little plug for why we do surveys. And really it's because we want to know your story. It really does help the Minneapolis Fed understand what the economy of the Ninth District is doing. And surveying is kind of the quickest, most efficient way to touch the most people. And it really gives us a way for two-way information sharing. So businesses and workers give us a lot of information, but we don't hold that tight. We don't just keep that to ourselves. We actually share that with the public. So when we do, for example, Joe does an egg credit survey, okay, 4 times a year. We don't just keep that information to us. We actually publish information. And my colleague Haley Shenander is the brains and brawn behind the general business survey that we do twice a year, and is actually our biggest survey. So that gathers an awful lot of information, and really important information, but we don't just keep that to ourselves. We do a webinar much like this one to publish those survey results so other people can learn what the Minneapolis Fed is learning as well. And the bonus for this in terms of survey work is that even if you see that we are surveying and you don't have time or interest in replying, that's okay, because you at least know that the Minneapolis Fed is interested in hearing from you. That's really one of the main things, is that we want the public to know that we are interested in what you have to say about current economic conditions. So this is also my opportunity to give you an opportunity for input. As I mentioned, the Minneapolis Fed's Business Pulse Survey is something that we are trying to build. We're a little bit 3 years in, and we're, I think, really building a nice survey here on a monthly basis. There's a web page that we have, our regional economic surveys, where you can get more information on our Business Pulse Survey. What I'm asking you today, for those business executives or managers, people with good information on your particular business, if you are interested in helping monetary policy, I'd love for you to be part of this panel, this survey panel. So if you use your phone and click on that QR code, that's an opportunity for you to be part of this regular pool of businesses that give us insights. And we would really, really appreciate your time and your insights going forward. I'll leave that up just for a second again, and we'll move forward. So now we have all that sausage. Okay, now we actually have to put it together. So I'm going to talk very, very briefly just about the compilation process itself, and it will be very quick, and then I will get to Eric. So once we have that info, well, we got to start putting it together. And the process itself obviously is a little bit quicker than gathering all of it. But just as a reminder, the Beige Book comes out, again, roughly every 6 weeks, 8 times a year. And each district writes their own report. Joe mentioned that as well. So there are several people that are involved in the drafting as well as the editing of our report. Okay. The aggregate, so as we're always aggregating data or gathering data, but in terms of kind of really organizing it, putting it together, synthesizing it, and drafting the report, typically happens about a little bit more than 2 weeks before the report's actual release. And first drafts, each bank is required to submit a first draft to the Board of Governors. Board of Governors has 2 regular reviewers that give feedback, and really what they are going to give us some edits and some suggestions, in terms of our wording or how we are phrasing something. And they are kind of in the position to help all of the banks have some kind of familiar narrative in terms of consistency and style and grammar. As I think Joe mentioned also, the national report is compiled by a single district bank on a rotating basis. We took our turn, I believe, last February, and it will be some time again before it circles around to us. So when we would have to do that national report compilation. And then the final report is released on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. And I think the nice part of it for us is that we see more and more media paying attention to it, more of the public paying attention to it. A decade ago, if I had been in a room of people that said I helped contribute to the Beige Book, people would be like, I don't have any idea what that is, or at least a lot of people would. Now I often get a lot of very, very curious people with perked up ears that want to know more. Hopefully this has helped answer some of that. But I also want to hand it off now. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to hand it off to Eric to kind of give you a little bit of information about the Beige Book accuracy and some other fun stuff. Eric, floor is yours.
Thank you, Ron, and I appreciate everyone being here as well. I hope you're enjoying and learning a lot about the process that goes into writing and publishing the Beige Book. And Joe touched a little bit on these earlier, and I will emphasize something that he said. The Beige Book is not to be used or to be interpreted as a forecasting tool, and I think that's very important to highlight as I go into the next few slides. Yet, some studies have shown that the Beige Book has traditionally correlated to public economic data. Some have also pointed out that it's a useful tool to detect some business cycle turns. And as Joe talked about, in each of the contributions to the Beige Book, each of the districts include a sentence on a characterizes either the overall economy, the labor market. Each of those sections that we write get a characterization, whether it's growing slightly, modest, moderate, strong. Just a reminder of what Joe talked about. For example, we will say the Ninth District economy was unchanged since the previous report. And so to construct, to kind of get a sense of how closely that correlates to the publicly available data, some of us constructed a data series and added a numeric value to each of those characterizations. And as you can see in this particular graph, Beige Book sentiment, has a tendency to correlate with the data. In this case, you're seeing the change in payroll employment is the 3-month average, and then you're also seeing the Beige Book, what we call the Beige Book index, right? Which is again, that characterization, but added a numeric number to give it some form. And so there is, again, one has to be careful about how to interpret these, but there's no denying that there is some correlation there. I will point towards the last, section of this particular chart and note that, for example, employment data, which still hasn't been, has not accounted for those revisions that were published, the annual revisions that were published a few weeks back, is running higher than the Beige Book sentiment will indicate. Next and last on this particular topic, prices, right? Similarly, sentiment regarding prices for both input and final prices, when we write the Beige Book, we do not distinguish from whether those are inputs or final prices. As you have heard, we hear from a lot of entrepreneurs. So, it might lean a little heavy on the input prices side. But overall, we also, ask whether final prices are increasing or decreasing, or they felt like they decreased compared to the last period. And so, we just decide on, how that has changed over the last period. And as you can see in this chart, the orange bars show that Beige Book sentiment on prices. The dark line is your personal consumption expenditures index, which is the preferred inflation measurement that the Fed uses. And there's no denying, there's some alignment between those two data sets. The methodology applied here is the same, as you can see on the left on the left axis. You have your strong, moderate, and modest levels of sentiment depending on the direction of that sentiment. And I would just say with these, people are very sensitive to price changes, so it's perhaps no surprise that as inflation rose after the pandemic, sentiment was higher than actual inflation. So that seems to be also a little bit of the case in recent months. But again, just something for you to kind of see what that looks like in a numerical way. And the next part of this, the next and last part of the presentation, as we before we get into questions, just Ron talked about more people paying attention to the Beige Book, and that is actually reflected also on the media. National Public Radio, Planet Money. A lot of you are probably very familiar with Planet Money. Releases these awards each time the Beige Book comes out. They they award the recipient of the Beigie, very creative name for the Beige Book, but it is it is a way of recognizing the most the most, I don't want to say fun, but the most attention-grabbing anecdote from the Beige Book that they consider it to be from all across the 12 districts. I have to say, and give us some props on this, because we have been recipients of the Beigie several times. I believe we're still the one with the most Beigies compared to other districts, and it's just a fun thing to see again that more people are paying attention, and that media is also helping give visibility to what I think is a very important document that, again, as you have heard throughout this presentation, doesn't attempt to measure the economy as a whole, but it adds some anecdotal evidence to reading the economy more closely. And with that, I know there are some questions on the chat, so I am actually going to call out Joe, because I believe there is the first one probably fits better for you. So somebody said here, when you say the sections are mandatory, what law or regulation makes the Beige Book mandatory?
Yeah, so that was in the section of our report of our presentation that I covered. And mandatory was maybe misleading terminology, so I appreciate you calling that out. There isn't a law or regulation that requires the Federal Reserve to produce the Beige Book, as far as I'm aware. In fact, when I say they're mandatory, just to be clear, what I meant by that is we, the 12 reserve banks, have all agreed that we will include sections on those things in our reports, because again, we want to be tying what we're doing back to supporting the monetary policy mission of the Fed and the dual mandate. So that's why we're all always thinking about employment and inflation, most especially, in addition to some of the other kind of sectoral indicators that we cover. So a little bit of an aside, just kind of on the second part of that question about sort of what requires the Fed to produce the Beige Book. Like I said, there's not a law or anything. The Beige Book was originally created at the behest of the chair. So just a quick aside, the Federal Reserve is sort of a uniquely structured institution. I mentioned we're a decentralized central bank. So there are 12 reserve banks that are responsible for the different Federal Reserve districts. Our operations are overseen by the Board of Governors in Washington, and the Board of Governors has 7 governors, one of whom is the chair of the Board of Governors. So the Board of Governors had originally asked the research departments and regional economics staff at the reserve banks to put together kind of a digest of their information gathering efforts, and that was kind of what led to the Beige Book, kind of in a more informal sense. But because of that sort of decentralized nature of the Fed, each of the reserve banks is really kind of owns and responsible for its own report. And so actually the sort of overseer, if you will, of the Federal Reserve is of the Beige Book is the Fed has a committee called the Conference of Presidents. That's the presidents of the 12 Federal Reserve Banks. So President Neil Kashkari in Minneapolis, and then there's 11 other colleagues who are presidents. And they kind of get together and they direct some of the activities that are centered at the reserve banks, including, among other things, research and regional economics and other outreach efforts. So they're kind of the sort of official governing body, if you will, of the Beige Book, to the extent that there is one. So that's kind of sort of who sort of owns the Beige Book, as it were. It's each of the reports is owned by the regional economics teams at the reserve banks, and kind of we collaborate together as a system. So it's a cooperative endeavor. And again, mandatory, maybe not the right word, because I think that makes people think of a law or a regulation, and there isn't something like that that requires the production of the Beige Book.
Thank you, Joe. Ron, why don't you take this one? Do you have any favorite indicators that you've used? In other words, what wins your Beige?
Great question. It's hard to say what wins a Beige, and I think, as you mentioned, you don't want to put too much emphasis on kind of these popularity contests. At the same time, we're glad that the Beiges are out there, because they bring the Beige Book to a much larger audience in terms of just telling the radio listeners that there is this thing called the Beige Book. In terms of like what I think what the three of us are listening for is, I think we're listening for something that really crystallizes a trend that maybe we thought about. I'll actually give you an example that didn't win a Beige that I thought might. I happen to be at a chamber roundtable at a location I won't name, but there was a conversation about labor markets and the fact that they seem to be loosening a little bit. And one of the people there said that there had been a local job fair recently, and they thought things were changing because more people showed up without pajamas on. And as soon as that person said that, I think everyone kind of recognizes what that means. It means that more workers are out there looking, but they're also paying attention to appearance. And so, which makes them probably a little bit more serious as job candidates. They know they can't just walk in and get a job. So I think it's little comments like that that really, I think, crystallize some kind of trend that maybe people are familiar with and they understand the quote. Because again, we only have 2 pages, and in many sections, just a paragraph, maybe 150 words, and you have to be able to communicate that thing, that curiosity, in a really, really quick way. And so I think that's kind of what we're looking to do, to not only bring that macro anecdotal information to bear, but also provide a little bit of human insight that people can understand and maybe relate to a little bit more.
Thanks,
Can I
Ron.
add something, Eric?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, just real quick. So one thing I mentioned in my comments was that the Beige Book has sort of a role as a kind of a disciplining device. It kind of makes us go out on a regular cadence and gather information. As Ron ran down, we do a lot of listening sessions. We do a ton of surveys. We have a lot of informal, person-to-person or several-person conversations as well. And we do this on all the time on an ongoing basis. And we hear a lot of the same things. We hear a lot of the same sort of stories and themes over and over and over again. And you might think that that would get a little bit monotonous. Part of this is just because there are commonalities across communities in our region. So if you're in a small town or rural area of the Ninth Federal Reserve District, and you think that you have a housing shortage in your community, you're in good company, because everybody else does too. So that's a very common thing that we hear. If you have a nursing shortage at your local hospital, join the club. Okay, that's another common real thing that we hear. So we hear a lot of the same stories over and over again. Ron mentioned that we hear about tightness in the labor market, limited shortage of workers and things like that. One of the things that's really valuable about hearing the same things over and over again, and I don't want to overstate the extent to which we're always hearing the same thing, but one thing that's valuable about hearing a lot of the same anecdotes, first of all, it reinforces that something about this is real. But also, when we hear something that we haven't heard before, it really lights up and really jumps out. So when we hear, like Ron just mentioned, some of the anecdotes about pointing to a softer labor market, we're coming off of a period where labor markets have been very tight. There's been a shortage of workers for a long time. So once we start hearing about an increase in job postings, an increase in the number of people applying for jobs, people being less prone to wear pajamas to job fairs, funner anecdotes like that as well, those all kind of point towards something is changing right now. And so that's part of the value of doing this on a constant basis, is when we hear something new, it really makes our ears perk up.
Thanks, Joe. I'm going to try to answer this next one very briefly, and then hopefully we have time for another question. Somebody asked, the Bureau of Labor Statistics had major revisions in their employment stats this year, over 900,000 jobs overstated. the Beige Book, has the Beige Book been more accurate? Why or why not? And I think that's what I was trying to point at towards the end. The labor chart that I showcased. That the 3-month average of employment or payroll employment. Towards the end tail of that chart seems to be running higher, meaning it's counting more jobs, right? Than the Beige Book sentiment. I mean, I want to be careful about how I say that, but it will appear that sentiment is more on, will be more on track with the revisions, because I actually emphasize that the data has not been updated to reflect those changes. So we will see, right? Like when the data gets updated at the beginning of next year, we should be able to see that those monthly changes, and we'll see how close the Beige Book was or was not.
Yeah.
To
Eric,
that.
could I have a word on that too?
Yes, please.
So I think first, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is still the gold standard. And I think we need to re-emphasize the fact that our data collecting machinery in the U.S. is world class, and the fact that they are revising is actually a really good example of really good data collecting. Not just collect it once and then move forward, but that always analyzing. And the one thing I would say in terms of their overestimate recent is, from my standpoint, it actually did help match what we were hearing more on the ground. And it is really, I think, a really useful exercise, again, that triangulation. What are we hearing on the ground? The official data didn't necessarily match it, but we have systems in place that are correct, that are self-correcting. And I think that's always really useful. We are self-correcting in the sense that we're always asking. We're not asking once, we're asking every month, we're asking all the time. And the same with data collecting organizations like the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They have a lot of people in place to do a job. I think they do it very well. And then they go back to check their work. And sometimes these things happen. And sometimes they actually align better after that revision.
Yeah, I will just end by adding that, that it is part of the regular process. It's not an unusual, step that they took. So with that, I think we have only like 2 minutes to respond to another question. And the last one is, I think, Ron, you touched a little bit on these. Are the nonprofit and public sectors included in the information gathering process? The short answer is yes, but I'll let you expand on that.
Yeah, yes, they are. In terms of our surveys, we let everybody, we want as many people to respond as possible. Government and nonprofit are very clearly important sectors in the economy. Now, some of the questions that we ask, like in terms of revenue and things like that, are less relevant for, say, people in the public sector that are responding, because their budgets are more fixed, and there's not a consumer demand for certain things. But in terms of nonprofits, they are also a very important part, and they are dependent on revenues that might come from government, they might come from corporate, it might come from individual givers, it might come from lots of sources. But whether or not their revenue is keeping up, whether they can hire, whether they're paying different prices for inputs, all of those things still matter. And we're always out there trying to get more and more input, more organizations to give us feedback so we understand the economy better.
Great. And with that, I think we can, we can call it.
Can I put in one plug,
Yeah,
Eric?
please.
I just want to mention real quick, our colleague Jeff Horwich is in the chat, and we would be remiss if we didn't point out that he does a lot of great work in the video space. And if you've enjoyed watching this long video of us talking about the Beige Book, wait till you get a load of the very short videos that we do recapping the Beige Book on an every report basis. You can find those on our social media channels. We give a quick rundown of what was in our latest report. And like I said, it's a lot shorter and a little bit pithier than we might have been today.
Good call. Thanks for remembering that. And with that, thank you everyone for being here. Remember to take that survey at the end of the webinar, and thanks.